It's that time of year again. Episode 3 of Before the Storm has released, I've played it, and I wanted to share my thoughts on it. And boy, do I have a lot of thoughts on it.
Whatever happens, Rachel, I'm here.
I went through a lot of emotions during this episode, and well after I had finished it, and from what I can see from the response online, it seems a lot of people went through the same process. On one hand, I enjoyed a lot about Hell is Empty and its many amazing moments and scenes, but it felt in a weird way like there was something missing, or better put, this episode had missed something important, and that something is what I want to explore. This is a very unique feeling for me since I really liked episode 1 and absolutely loved episode 2, so to come away from this feeling so unsure and conflicted for an episode that did a lot of great things is strange and unfortunate to say the least. I think to start, I'll talk about what I love in this episode first, and then I'll move on to the other stuff. Just like the second episode, I think the first 30 minutes or so of Hell is Empty are just excellent. Even though we start off with another meeting similar to the Wells meeting, this one was way more important and interesting. Not just because of what we learn or the edge of your seat tension throughout this scene, but because of this very strange and very different approach to telling us a story in Life is Strange. Blacking out everything around Chloe and Rachel and taking them on a journey of unraveling this lie from James, looking through the same viewfinder we used to discover this lie. I really like this surreal approach to showing us past events, and I love the way Deck 9 were able to create this atmosphere and tension going into the scene with a different continuing version of Sarah's song Witches from Daughter's album for this game.
You can handle this. Not without you.
And speaking of music creating atmosphere, we get to the next amazing scene.
Rachel?
Gotta say, I think I like this opening credit sequence more than the one in episode 2, mostly because we get to continue this amazing moment and snoop around Rachel's bedroom, inspecting all the little details that give us an insight into who she is and what's important to her, what she looks to for inspiration, and what she keeps around for retrospection. I love that her bedroom is a stark contrast to the rest of the Amber's house. It's her own little world in here, from the cool wallpaper to the stars behind her bed to the quotes and pictures she keeps around. It really feels like an actual person lives here, trying to make this space her own. Bedrooms, I think, are important in Life is Strange. They can tell us a lot about the person who it belongs to, and Rachel's bedroom doesn't disappoint. All of these little details, combined with Chloe shining the stars on the ceiling and the music in the background, made for another incredible moment between her and Rachel. Sure, it wasn't as magical as the Tempest scene or as important as the first kiss, but I don't think it needed to be. It just needed to be as simple as a friend trying to comfort another friend. Show Rachel that her world hasn't ended just yet, and that Chloe is there for her.
It used to be the only part that mattered.
Another thing I really loved was Rihanna Devries' performance as Chloe in this episode. There are a lot of intense moments, such as Chloe talking to James about the events leading up to Rachel in the hospital. The emotion and the stress and the shock she was able to convey in Chloe's voice was masterfully done, and I was incredibly enthralled by her entire performance throughout this episode. Same going for Kylie Brown as Rachel, and the very emotional moments we experience with her. I felt both of their performances in the previous 2 episodes were great and all, but this one definitely showed off their strengths and skills as performers. Going technical for a second, I also just love the body language in this episode, like how visibly shaken Chloe appears when she learns the truth about James and Damon. It's another example of Deck 9 trying to make Chloe feel as real and as grounded as possible, and this was a really great detail to add. But I think some of my favorite moments in this episode are the important ones for Chloe.
Rewind.
hearing Chloe's truck finally come to life, and her appropriately celebrating. And just Chloe's transformation overall, from someone who couldn't give a fuck about anything to finally having someone to fight and care for.
I almost lost her. She's fearless. She's brilliant and talented. And she feels so much. She's so strong.
So there was a lot to love in this episode.
But yeah, badass too.
But unfortunately, this is going to be that part in the video where there's some things, big and small, I didn't really like. Let's start with the small stuff first, like some of the more prominent technical glitches I noticed, like Rachel's hand curling weirdly in this scene, or her body transporting to another side of the bed when Chloe turns the light off, or Sarah ice skating on the ground in the flashback. I don't know if she's standing on her toes or whether she's actually meant to wear heels here, I don't know, it just looks weird. Or the music not being mixed as well as the other episodes. Like if you let All I Wanted play for a little bit in Rachel's bedroom and choose to leave, the music will play loudly for a good few seconds while Rachel talks. Or when Rachel gets stabbed by Damon and we hear Burn It Down start to play, it very awkwardly becomes very quiet as the game loads to the next level and then picks right back up when we get to the hospital. It seemed like Deck 9 wanted to have these two scenes connected without a loading screen, but because of their technical limitations they couldn't. But they tried to do it anyway. This might seem like I'm nitpicking some of the more smaller issues that don't matter that much, but I think when you take all of these into consideration, it certainly feels like Deck 9 didn't put enough polish into this episode, and it can make it feel a little rushed. And then there's some bigger things I had issues with, like Elliot's scene in James's office. I don't think I've properly talked about Elliot in any of my previous videos, and the reason for that is because I felt he was such a forgettable character. We learned that he's a friend of Chloe and that he has a pretty weird obsession with her, but he always just felt like an element in the background, like there really wasn't anything more there. So for him to come in all of a sudden in this episode and start acting like a psycho because he's upset Chloe isn't paying enough attention to him really felt more like a distraction rather than an interesting turn on his character. He does point out a lot of the flaws between Chloe and Rachel and questions whether she actually cares about Chloe or whether she's manipulating Chloe to get in trouble while she gets off scot-free. But I mean, what kind of asshole just constantly points out these flaws about Rachel when it's obvious that right, yeah, okay. Look, regardless of his little speech, I still felt Elliot was more of a barrier we had to get through because the game at this point needed to give us a barrier to get through. I think there could have been a better way to address these trust issues rather than him coming out of nowhere and dropping all of this on us, and I'll expand on this more in my analysis video. There's a ton of other issues I have with this scene and a number of other scenes, but I think I should talk about my biggest issue with this episode, and that's with Sarah and the further unraveling of James'S lie. We first learned that the reason Sarah isn't a part of Rachel's life is because James had taken her away due to Sarah's drug addiction, which was putting their family in danger. Part of this arrangement involved James sending money to Sarah to stay away. We learn later on, however, that Sarah has been clean for a year. She's been able to support herself and is rejecting the checks James is still sending to her, and now Sarah wants to meet her daughter. She's spoken to a lawyer to try and establish contact with her and has come to Arcadia Bay to talk with James to work out some arrangement. James doesn't want this and feels Sarah can't just decide to become a mother one day. However, James takes this a step further, and later we learn that he's working with Damon Merrick to scare off Sarah, and then takes it another step further and hires Damon to inject heroin into Sarah's system as a fucked up way to either say drug addicts don't change, or just wanting to get Sarah's addiction started again so that she'll stay away from Rachel. Either way, it's a really fucked up thing to do, and it leads us to this chapter, where we see Frank Bowers fight and somehow kill Damon with an injury he obtained from losing his previous fight with Damon, but then after that we sit down with Sarah. And in the conversation with Sarah, she reveals she doesn't want Rachel to know the truth about what James has done, hiring Damon to inject her with heroin. She advises that she doesn't want to destroy the idea of Rachel's father because she loves him and doesn't want Rachel to experience that loss, regardless of James's actions, and because of this, she doesn't want to meet Rachel. And that's where my whole issue with this story comes in. Why is Sarah all of a sudden dropping every legitimate reason she has to meet her daughter and giving us this task of not revealing the truth to Rachel so that she won't hate her father? She claims James is right and that she's broken, that she'll never be the mother that Rachel wants to meet, and that's why they can't meet. But everything Sarah did before the events of Before the Storm, getting clean, supporting herself, and coming to Arcadia Bay indicated she wanted to meet Rachel. So if she feels she isn't the mother that Rachel wants to meet, why did she go through all the trouble to turn her life around to meet Rachel? Later, Sarah exclaims that nothing will change her past mistakes, and because of that, she'll never be able to be Rachel's real mother. But why in the fuck do her past mistakes of drug addiction have any weight in her argument, since she's proven she's moved past them when James is right now in the present working with drug dealers to force Sarah to be the person she's not anymore? It was not her choice to take heroin. Her argument would have been valid if she willingly took heroin, proving that she is still a drug addict and would still be a danger to Rachel, but she didn't, and she still treats this situation of being forced to take heroin as though she is still this horrible drug addict, which she is not. Now, I'm going to say I don't have any experience with drug addiction, but I imagine the reason Sarah is saying this is because she has been drugged regardless of whether it was her intention or not, and now she's going to fall down that hole of addiction again, and that she's not strong enough to beat it again. But that does not mean at all that she didn't beat her addiction previously, or that she started supporting herself as a way to prove that she's changed to see Rachel. It does not at all remove any of the legitimate reasons Sarah has to meet Rachel. Sarah, because of this entire situation, has all the more reason legally and ethically to see Rachel, which is what she wanted for the entire game, all the way up to when she had heroin injected into her system. So for Sarah to just completely drop her desire to meet Rachel and drop her completely legitimate reasons for meeting Rachel and agree with James that she is the person that James says she is when it's not at all her fault for being that person is just kind of dumb. I get that Sarah believes that this isn't about James or herself, but it's about sparing Rachel from any further pain her father would cause if she did know the truth, but Sarah, considering everything, has absolutely no proper motivation to do this, and her reasoning as to why she is doing this is not at all her fault. Instead, it should be fueling her desire to meet Rachel because all of her hard work to meet Rachel was unfairly taken away by her loving father. It almost feels like Sarah had to completely change her motivations as a character so that she can have this conversation with Chloe about protecting Rachel from the truth, so that we have a final choice to make at the end of this episode. This entire thing, narrative-wise, character-wise, motivation-wise, just doesn't make any sense otherwise. Anyway, since we're talking about the final choice, you can probably already guess what I chose. I didn't really have to think about it that much, considering I had no motivation to protect Rachel from the truth, since Sarah had no real motivation to protect Rachel from the truth. She has no reason to protect Rachel's idea of her loving father because she has no reason to agree with James that she is this horrible drug addict that James is trying to protect Rachel from, which she is not. She just magically thinks this so that we have a moral conundrum to decide on, because we apparently need a moral conundrum to decide on because shit, there was one in season 1. Better follow their lead on how to make an ending. Look, to be fair, I am glossing over a ton of detail here. Further things we learn in the conversation we have with Sarah, this underlying theme of lying throughout this game, our conversation with William, the obvious comparisons we can make between Sarah and Rachel from the flashback, and I'm going to look at all of this in more detail in my analysis video, but as it stands now, there's a lot of issues here, and unfortunately, this was a very disappointing element of Before the Storm. Which does bring me back to what I mentioned earlier about what was missing from this episode. Promise I won't go on a rant this time. I think there's definitely some comparisons you can make between this episode and Polarized, the finale of season 1. And I think the mistake both of these episodes make is losing the focus on what's important. I'll expand on my thoughts about Polarized another day, but I think the misstep for this episode was shifting its focus to another story element that originally wasn't the important foundation that made Before the Storm so special. And I think the crucial mistake that Deck 9 made was making the climax of this episode derive from that story shift. This lie from James and the mystery of Rachel's real mother were important, but those story elements mainly served as a vehicle for Rachel and Chloe to come together, just as the mystery of Rachel Amber's disappearance served as a vehicle for Max and Chloe to become closer. So for these vehicles the story was using to move along all of a sudden come front and center as the climax for this episode can feel a little underwhelming, since the build up to these final choices only started in this final episode. I've said it a million times before, but I'll say it again. Chloe and Rachel's relationship is what makes the story of Before the Storm so special. Every single memorable and great moment in these episodes come from the interactions they have with each other. The train scene, the therapy session, the Tempest play, the neighborhood, and Rachel's room. So I think the reason I'm so torn on this episode, the reason I feel something is missing, is because their relationship gets pushed to the side for the second half of this episode, and the finale instead rests on this previously underlying story element of Rachel's mother and whether it's okay to lie to someone to protect them, when really it should have ended on another important milestone for Chloe and Rachel's relationship. I've seen a lot of people describe this as there wasn't an Amber Price moment in this episode, and yeah, I can admit I'm a bit disappointed these two didn't have a special moment. Rachel's room was great, I really liked it, but as I mentioned, it wasn't at the level of the Tempest scene or the kiss. But I think there was a bigger missed opportunity here than just an Amber Price scene. I think what was missing here was the culmination of their relationship, something that has been building up through our decisions and our interactions, and instead it was cast aside for something else. The montage at the end was great, I guess, but I think Chloe and Rachel deserved better than a montage this game uses to end every Life is Strange episode. But if we're talking about the end of Life is Strange episodes, you can probably guess what I'm going to talk about next. So yeah, this happens. When I initially saw this, I was pretty fucking shocked, let me tell you. I couldn't really process how I felt about this right after I had seen it, but after thinking about it for a while, I get why Deck 9 included it. It serves as a cold reminder of the terrible fate that awaits Rachel and Chloe. It's a reminder that we can forget about the past all we want and ignore the future as much as we can in the moment, but eventually it's going to hit us like a ton of bricks. Just like the looks Frank and Rachel were giving each other earlier in the episode, serving as a reminder of their future together and the lie that Rachel tells Chloe. This post-credit scene also serves as a bit of a teaser for people who might play Before the Storm first and then play Season 1 afterwards, something to start the mystery of Rachel Amber's disappearance. So I get why it was included, but I'm still unsure on whether it was really necessary to show. Even with all the legit reasons I mentioned earlier, a part of me is still questioning whether it was even a good choice to include it. I'll expand on this more in my analysis video, mainly because I just haven't narrowed down all my reasoning just yet, and this video is getting a little long. So yeah, that's my first impressions of this episode. A lot to love, a lot to nitpick, and a lot to really dislike. If I had to leave a closing comment for my first impressions, it would be this. I like this episode, but at the same time, I'm disappointed as well. Episode 1 was such an amazing start to this story, and such a sigh of relief that this prequel wasn't just going to be a cash grab, that Deck 9 knew what they were doing with this game, and Episode 2 further solidified that, becoming, I think, maybe one of my favorite episodes of Life is Strange ever, including Season 1. Both had their issues and both weren't perfect, but their strengths more than enough made up for their weaknesses. And unfortunately, I just don't know whether I can say the same for this episode, and I think that's why I'm so torn on Hell is Empty. regardless of how I feel about it, what do you guys think of this episode of Before the Storm? Are you just as torn as me? Definitely let me know in the comments. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to my ramblings and watch my video. Thanks for coming on this journey with me as we play Before the Storm, and there'll be much more to come. And I hope you have an amazing day.